Well, hi everyone. I'm Kyle Pitts, Director of Development Operations here at Food Finders Food Bank. Thank you so much for joining us. A couple of housekeeping items. We will be recording this town hall today. And if you have questions at any time, please just enter them into the chat and we will direct them towards our speakers. Today, we will be discussing the recent White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health, the findings and what that means for us locally. We will be talking with Emily Weichert Bryant, Executive Director of Feeding Indiana's Hungry, the network of Feeding America food banks in the state of Indiana. And also joining us is Jason Lusk, Distinguished Professor and Head of the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. And additionally, we have Food Finders CEO Katie Bunder on with us as well. We will start with Katie.
Welcome, and thank you all for joining us for today's town hall. I want to tell you that we have more extensive biographies of Emily and Jason in the chat. So if you'd like a little more information about them, you can find it there. And I want to thank them both for joining us today to talk about the impact of the conference, especially here in Indiana. So thank you both for joining us. The last White House Conference on Hunger in 1969 generated over 1,800 recommendations. 1,600 of those recommendations were implemented over the next 2 years, including major expansions of the food stamp program, the school lunch program, authorization of supplemental feeding program for women, infants, and children, WIC, and improvements to nutrition labeling and ingredient labeling. Do you think this White House conference will have an impact equal to the one held in 1969? Either one of you.
Go ahead, Jason.
Oh, I don't want to be the cynic, but hard to say, in part because I think as just an outsider watching it, there's a lot of speculation about how it was going to come together, who was leading it, was it going to happen, who's in charge, all those sorts of things. And it kind of, did indeed come together in the end. Of course, I wasn't around when that 60s conference happened, so I don't know if it was, maybe a lot of things sort of worked like that in DC. But I think you really need a champion for some of these ideas and policy proposals, and some of that may well depend on how elections go in the next couple of weeks to see what happens there. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment as to what impact this White House conference will have. So I think it's too soon to tell whether it'll have the kind of 1960s impact from my perspective.
And Emily, you were in the room, so what's your perspective on this?
I would agree with Jason. I think, again, I wasn't there in the 60s either. I think it's monumental that it happened because it's not something that happens every year. It's not an annual conference. I think it was monumental that there was bipartisanship involved. Senator Braun was on a panel and was he's working with Senator Booker on a lot of food as medicine conversation, which is great. I think largely it's up to a lot of us to see what comes out of this conference, because there's a 44-page report that came out. There was a supplementary report that came out from the USDA about what the Food and Nutrition Service is doing in these places. But unless we continue to make sure that it happens, it's not that I don't trust the administration to do it, but administrations change, policy priorities change, Congress changes. So there's a lot of moving pieces. And if we want to accomplish not only really what's set out in this policy document, but the actual goal of alleviating and eliminating hunger by 2030, that's not just what's in the report, that's everybody.
Yeah. I want to go into the pillars of the outcomes, and they have 5 pillars that are the different areas that they hope to tackle. But before I do that, I'd like to ask each of you, why do you think that this White House conference was held at this time?
I honestly think it's because Congressman McGovern kept talking about it. He's really been the impetus for this. He's sort of the fairy godfather of the fact that this happened in the first place. I will say there were a lot of elected officials who were invited when the president spoke. He's one of the few who was there the entire day and sat at the front of every presentation in the middle. So he was staring right at the speakers. I think it's been his mission to make that happen. And I think he's really the reason that he was able to bring in bipartisanship. Congresswoman Walorski worked on this with him as the co-chairs of the Hunger Caucus. Senator Baird and Senator Braun and Senator Booker. That's really, I think, why this happened, and an administration who was willing to listen to it.
I certainly am not going to contradict anything Emily said, because I think she's right. The broader context I would add is, coming out of the pandemic, where there was a lot of uncertainty about food supply chains, resiliency, the increase in demand for food through food banks, the rising food price inflation, like that broader context was also, I think, a motivating factor that led to the conference.
From my perspective at the food bank, I think I would have guessed that one of you would have said because food insecurity is so bad right now. We are experiencing the highest numbers we've ever had, and higher than the middle of the pandemic.
So Kathleen, I don't want to derail your conversation, but this is one issue where as somebody who's sort of on the data side of things, not on the side that you're on, dealing with the actual people and programs, most of the data we have, hasn't shown a big increase in food insecurity, whether it's USDA numbers. There's a Census Pulse survey that measures food sufficiency. We have a survey we've been running out of Purdue for the past year, and we have those data don't seem to suggest like a big spike in food insecurity. But then I hear the same things you're saying from other folks. I'm having a hard time reconciling that. I don't know if you have any insights into that.
I'm wondering if it's that your data is lagging behind, because we've seen the biggest surge really just in the last 3 months. And it's directly related, I think, to food and gas prices.
I think some of it.
We used to see about between 300 and 400 households per day in the fresh market in Lafayette. And we've had one day where we had 800 households in the fresh market in one day, but more typically it's closer to 500 households, but still that's a significant increase. And the number of new people coming to our fresh market is up dramatically.
And I think some of that is because the food insecurity, depending on how the question is asked, is a little self-reporting. One of the things that we've always sort of struggled with in the hunger relief sector is, if you ask someone if they're food insecure, are they taking into account that they are getting food from a pantry or have SNAP benefits? And is that what's making them secure? Or do they view that as being insecure? I agree, Jason. The data shows that that's not what's happening. I've been hearing it more from our members this year. And I think it's a combination of things. And I think it's folks don't feel that they're food insecure. Maybe they feel they're being impacted by inflation, and as a matter of caution and that safety net, I think is where we're seeing that those two things kind of don't line up the way we would expect them to see.
That's a great point. That's an answer I've given sometimes to people in this response, is maybe our safety nets are working, and so people are falling through them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, let's move into the first pillar of the White House conference, which is the Biden-Harris plan wants to improve food access and affordability. Do you think the recommendations from the conference will make it easier for food insecure Hoosiers to access food?
Maybe I can start, because I suspect Emily's going to have a lot more real world on the ground level information. I think at a high level, it's really hard to improve affordability. You just can't make food cheaper magically or less expensive. And from a broad context, food, just like food prices, despite the inflation we're experiencing at the moment, food as a share of people's income is relatively low, both in historical standards and also anyway, I guess, food is relatively affordable, and, we might ask, well, how did it get that way? And can we continue to go down that path? And I think, I've got a self-interest here as somebody working at Agricultural Research University, but, investments in improving, yields, improving our ability to produce food at an effective manner, improving storage so we reduce waste, all those things I think have helped contribute to that more affordable food system. And I think that's the long-term strategy in thinking about improving food prices, is continuing to ensure that we are have both technological and, social developments that enable us to deliver food at an affordable rate, because it does cost something, and that's hard to change. The accessibility question is a more challenging one, I think, to think about sometimes. And there is a debate in economic circles about sometimes, particularly as we're talking about healthy foods, how much of that is demand versus supply driven. Is there not healthy, accessible foods because people in certain communities don't want them, aren't willing to pay for them? Or is it because there's some supply side issues that prevent those options from being there? My reading of that research suggests that the bigger answer to that question is the demand side. It's hard for it to be profitable sometimes to enter into some communities with particularly healthier options, but it doesn't mean that there's not a role to play to thinking about how can we bring affordable, accessible options. I think that's where food banks and others really aim to improve that affordability. I think one dimension of these discussions that maybe didn't come through as clear as maybe somebody like me might like to see in some of these is, what are the barriers to more affordable, more accessible food? Do we have regulatory barriers? Do we, what are the things preventing us from getting there today and now? And do we have an environment, an entrepreneurial environment where companies want to move in and provide affordable food? I think those, if we can lower the cost to people that want to come in and provide affordable, healthy options to consumers, that's one way I try to think about some of those issues. So and sort of regulatory environment around the offering of new options and varieties.
Yeah,
This is Steve. I've got one thing and the validity behind all, right now they're talking about a diesel fuel shortage, which is going to impact the ability to deliver all kinds of products, particular food, to sites. And that is going to drive up, if this truly does exist, it is going to drive up costs. And I think it's going to accelerate the food insecurity issue that Kathy was just talking about. And I mean, I think that really ought to be a concern of ours if that is truly the environment that we're looking at. It's going to make it a lot more expensive for not just food, but all kinds of things.
yeah, that makes sense. And I would agree with what Jason said. If we're talking about access and we're talking about affordability, those are two very different conversations. Affordability is not something that is really addressed in this particular document because it's not talking about food systems policy. It's not talking about greater agriculture policy. And that's, I mean, we could have an entirely different call to talk about that. It's not my area of expertise, but I understand that when we're talking about affordability, there's a lot of issues at play there. Trade, support, availability, weather, climate change, all these things are making a big difference on what's affordable for the most part. But what it really does try to address is access. And so there were some good pieces in Pillar 1 that really hit on some things that are possible or can be easily possible with the administration, moving levers. So making sure that WIC is being modernized. Right now, you can order your groceries online for SNAP, but you can't with WIC. And when WIC is the largest supplier, is not quite the right word, but the largest utilizer WIC recipients are for formula, if you can't get the formula where you normally shop, you're going to want to order it in advance and make sure that you're getting it somehow, whether you're going to pick it up or it's being shipped to you. If you want to get to that before it's gone, because that's still not flowing smoothly, that sort of modernization is key. Making sure that when we're talking about cross pollination, if you're already on one program, that's means tested, why are we not sort of automatically populating you into another means tested program? And these are all things that can be done relatively straightforwardly. I was disappointed that the Emergency Food Assistance Program, TFAP, which is the commodity food that our members distribute, including Food Finders here in Indiana, wasn't mentioned as sort of the strategy. Data has changed on this, but typically speaking, the food that's being distributed through this program is of better value of what's actually getting back to the farmer in that food purchase, as opposed to regular commercial sales. And there's also a price support mechanism with what we call it bonus or Section 32, which has been used over time to bring in boatloads of milk or, load after load of canned corn was going on when I started, because I remember people saying, please don't send me any more canned corn. We have all that we need. But it's a price support mechanism designed to pull product out of the market that's not moving. And that goes, it's fantastic product, it's healthy, it's nutritious, it's going to the food banks for distribution. And that sort of thing wasn't discussed. Not that that's going to stop us from asking for it. So, we continue to have those conversations because that's part of the picture, right? If we want for the federal nutrition programs that were discussed in this pillar to be accessible and available, to make sure that they're getting to people where they are. It didn't really mention anything about SNAP benefits for service members. It's something else that we look at. But being able to have those programs as a safety net, and then TFAP for what the private sector uses, the charitable sector, there wasn't really anything in there about making it more, make more sense to private sector folks to donate to food banks, things like that. So that's the food access piece, which is very different than affordability.
Can I piggyback on something Emily said? I think you made the comment about, WIC access online, and I know that's over the course of the last couple of years, a lot more online access of SNAP. I think which is really a good thing, but then people have to have online access, right? That kind of dovetails with this broader discussion, say in rural areas about rural broadband or access to cell phones. And then you gotta have somewhere, if you're gonna order food online that can be delivered, do you have a place for it to be delivered? And so I think those are the next steps, kind of to go along with that. I think maybe from a state perspective, that state legislatures can think about.
Great. So the second pillar, I think, is pretty closely related to the first, and that's integrating nutrition and health. The administration proposes expanding Medicare and Medicaid to cover medically tailored meals for people with diet-related health conditions. And they also propose introducing legislation to support pilot programs for food as medicine initiatives. Do you think this is a good idea? And do you think it would work in Indiana? And where would the money come from for this?
That's a really loaded question on the money part, Katie. So do I think it is useful? Yes. Do I think it would be helpful in Indiana? Yes, it's already happening in some places. So talking about, medically tailored meals, you do see those for some folks on Medicare. And I should have led with, I am not a healthcare expert. I am not an expert at Medicare or Medicaid, nor do I ever aspire to be. But using those 1115 waivers is something that is not hard to do to get a state to engage in that. And if you've got that waiver, that's actually what the feds pay for. So there's that piece of it. Now that's someone still paying for it. That's a whole different conversation.
Emily, could you explain what an 1115 waiver is?
I can try. So if you are traditional Medicaid is essentially you are low income with just there are activities of daily living that you can't provide. You are not healthy and you were low income. If you're sort of on traditional Medicaid, it's providing you healthcare and maybe in a residential setting. So when we start talking about Medicaid waivers, it's for an age blind and disabled population who wouldn't necessarily need to be served in an institutional setting. So we have these for all sorts of stuff. Section 1115 is just it's the code citation in that particular law that has become the buzz phrase for what you're looking at. But essentially, it's the opportunity to try something different with the approval of Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, with their approval that it's serving folks in home in a different way than they would if they were in an institutional sort of care setting. Yeah, that's the 101 level, and that's about all the better I can give you. But looking at medically tailored meals is definitely helpful because that's what we're doing in a lot of settings already, whether it's Meals on Wheels, whether it's, Older Americans Act money actually pays for a lot of food for low income, particularly seniors. Same sort of thing that we see with our commodity supplemental food boxes, which is somewhat medically tailored. We know that diet related health conditions are a huge problem across the country. Gleaners had a breakfast with the Indianapolis Business Journal this morning, and one of the stats was that by age 35, children right now have this ridiculously high opportunity to be obese. So, it's not just older folks, it's everyone. And so by hitting folks who are either older and on Medicare, or who are less well and on Medicaid with medically tailored food, it will make a tremendous difference in their health outcomes. And we know that. It's just a matter of creating those systems and funding them to make those connections. And that is the end of my Medicaid and Medicare expertise right there.
Jason, do you have any opinions on this?
Yeah, maybe it's my cynical nature or what have you. I'm not a big fan of the food as medicine phrase. And I probably can't say it any better than the journalist Tamara Haspel. She has a piece in the Washington Post on a regular basis, sort of articulating her concerns with that conflation. But some of it sort of relates to, like, you know, how people think about what food is doing, and it can perpetuate some bad things. Well, if food is medicine, I don't need to take my cholesterol medication, or I don't need to take my diabetes medication, or there are, you know, I would call them conspiracy theories, you know, even people like, well, if I go just to a fruit and vegetable diet, it will cure my cancer, which is, you know, just not true. So I have some concerns with it from that perspective. But the third point, like, should we be thinking about health and the impacts of food on health? Yeah, I mean, that seems like a no-brainer from my perspective. So I think I'm just mainly complaining about word usage there, because I think you're right. You know, there's a lot of dietary related diseases, whether it's, say, diabetes, for example, that have specialized diets, and particularly as we're thinking about low income communities, I'm thinking about diets that fit, you know, particular dietary related diseases people have. That just makes a lot of sense to me, that we need to think through some of those combinations. I think a broad thing for folks to think about, maybe gets back to this thing I mentioned before about what's causing what, that there's pretty strong evidence that, you know, demand for health, you know, increases with income. And so it's what we economists call a normal good. The higher income you have, the more you tend to have the time, ability to think about health. And so, how can we instill those concerns about health among lower income people, make it affordable? I know there's a huge debate about whether eating healthier is more costly, and I'm not going to wade into that here necessarily. But I think when we think about the burden of the cost of dietary related diseases, and we think about the challenges, whether it's demand driven or supply driven, about healthy food eating in low income households, I don't have the answers for those things, but I think there's certainly a very important set of conversations to have.
My question about who's going to pay for it was because we get at least a call a week from somebody who wants us to provide healthy food boxes, diet, you know, like for diet, usually it's for diabetes or for high blood pressure. And the specialized food, like low sodium canned green beans and things like that you would need to put in a box with non-perishable food that's healthier, it's really expensive. And so, you know, it's funny to me that it's often a hospital that's calling us and wanting us to provide these boxes. And who would you think has more funding to pay for that, a hospital or a food bank, you know? But that there's usually no money to go with it. They're just requesting the boxes. So I wondered when they talked about it at the White House conference if they were talking about any source of funding for that. So.
I think the longer term strategy, which doesn't answer the short term, you know, question about who's going to pay for that, you know, can of beans today. But I guess the argument is, if you pay for that now, you don't have higher Medicare or Medicaid costs at some point in the future. And so there is the argument that in the long run, it'll pay for itself in terms of lower Medicare or Medicaid costs, but that, you know, that doesn't pay for the cost today.
Right. And since the government is who would benefit from the lower Medicare and Medicaid costs, then they should probably provide the funding for the medically tailored boxes. And maybe that's the intention. So, but I guess nothing concrete at this point. Do you think so? Another thing that I was really interested in was when they were talking about trying to incentivize under this pillar, incentivize the SNAP recipients to purchase with their SNAP dollars more produce. And our experience at the food bank has been that we don't need to incentivize people to take good produce. I think that it's kind of I think it's a mistake to think that low income people don't want produce until Gleaners opened their produce mix. We didn't have very good produce to offer people, and I don't blame them for not wanting that. But as soon as we got fresh, good produce on hand, it's the first thing to fly off the shelves every time we open the pantry. So I wanted to ask you all about the incentives for SNAP recipients. It's like the double up bucks thing at the farmer's market, where we create, I think, you know, some hoops for people to jump through in order to get more SNAP dollars. Did you hear anything about that, Emily?
Not specifically. So I will say there were, when the day of the conference, there were 2 rounds of breakout sessions with each of the 5 pillars. There's one of me, so I was in 2 of them of the 10, and I haven't had a chance to go back and watch all the rest of them yet. But I understand what you're saying. I think there are valid points to be made that the double up bucks and those sort of programs are sort of a fine line between nutrition and anti-hunger and food systems support, because they're being used typically at farmers markets. There's a whole different conversation going on about local food and farmers markets and availability of produce. I don't think there's a bad way to go about incentivizing, but I think you're right. It's not that our clients are intentionally not picking up produce. It's because lots of other things. And going back to the notion of client choice, I don't make good choices. There was bacon in my breakfast this morning, right? Like, that's not healthy. That's a sometimes food. And it could be that what they're getting from the charitable sector is, we know that that's only part of their diet. So maybe they've got other resources, or maybe they're using their SNAP benefits to go to the store and get the no salt included canned vegetables or the frozen vegetables because it's going to last them longer and it's what they need. It's not a bad program, and it certainly can increase access to healthy foods and to produce. But that, at least in Indiana, is also a seasonal proposition for the most part. There's a winter farmers market in Indianapolis. I think there's one in Bloomington. There are ways that those benefits, if there are other ways that this, you can go about this with double up bucks. It's not always at farmers markets. It's not exclusively run that way. But I think it's a much longer conversation to talk about incentivizing anything really, because we're no one's incentivizing me to not have that bacon for breakfast. And there's the dignity of food choice. One of the things that the conference didn't talk about was the root causes of how clients get put in these situations. There were, I think, 60 people with lived experience who were at the White House conference, about half of whom Feeding America brought from our member food banks to participate. And those were the voices that we needed to hear more of. There was a woman that was sitting next to me in one of the sessions after, when we were sort of decompressing, and she was saying, yeah, these things are all great. My SNAP benefits went up, but so did eggs and so did milk. Yay, it's a 12% increase, so is inflation, and it's still difficult to afford these things. So the access piece for me is always sort of a secondary, or the healthy food access for me is a secondary piece. We want to make sure they're eating first. Yeah. And if we're going to be honest about what that looks like, we need to be honest about benefit levels, about how we evaluate SNAP benefits with the Thrifty Food Plan. And what sort of, you can have that larger food systems conversation about what is affordable, right?
I think, Emily, you nailed it. And I would say, to carry that on, whether it's local or farmers market or fourth and fifth order, kind of considerations from my perspective. So I think one fear I would have about some of these incentive-based programs is, not stigmatizing, current members, not making it more challenging. Because sometimes when you start talking about incentives, it's not just making the healthy less expensive, it's making quote unquote unhealthy more expensive. And I worry more about just overall benefit levels, whether the program's accessible, and whether it being a paternalizing kind of program for people that don't feel like, you've got to follow a real strict set of rules. The other thing I will say is that I've done some research on this topic too, is while I certainly, Kathleen, will rely on your, judgment that the people in your, that you're working with want those fresh fruits and vegetables. The truth is they're wanted even more by high income consumers. So by some of these incentive programs that, lower the price of, say, fruits and vegetables. Those subsidies tend to flow to higher income consumers because they're already consuming more of those. Doesn't mean to increase, that by lower income consumers too, but it's just those sort of subsidy dollars tend to flow to the folks that were already, consuming those diets already. So, yeah, I don't have any problem with trying to think about, some of this double up kind of problems, but I guess the broader issue that I worry a little bit about is are the levels high enough in general? Because there is a fair amount of research to suggest that, that a lot of what, say, SNAP dollars are doing is it's, most households that receive SNAP are spending more on food than they receive in SNAP. So
Okay.
in a sense, it's acting as an income transfer. And there's a big academic debate about whether it's, people treat that money differently than they would a cash transfer, which is probably not all that important to go into right now. But I would worry more about the total dollar amounts than, with the healthy food part of it. But I think it's certainly an important second order kind of conversation.
After 14 years of watching low-income households choose food, I feel pretty strongly that if we just increase SNAP dollars, they would buy more healthy food, especially more produce, milk, eggs. That's what people always want and what food pantries often don't have. But before we leave this topic, Kyle, would you mind describing your experience with the Double Up program in the Lafayette area?
Sure. We worked with the market manager at the West Lafayette Farmers Market back when I was a SNAP outreach coordinator when I first started at the food bank. And the West Lafayette Farmers Market, it just wasn't a place where low income people were coming. So they weren't really cashing them in. So
we paid, or actually City Bus donated free bus rides from our pantry here on Greenbush Street to the West Lafayette Farmers Market. And the city of West Lafayette got the machine that you have to get from, I guess, the state, or I don't know where it comes from. And then we had to staff it. So there was considerable city resources, bus resources, and food bank resources that went into having this machine. And very, very few people took advantage of it. And I asked myself, like, if somebody told me, well, honestly, I don't go to the farmer's market as often as I should because it's one more trip. And if you're going to the grocery store, you can just pick your food up there. So I think we're asking an awful lot of people that live very stressful lives when we put those kind of incentives in place.
So Kathleen, in that part of that question that you would ask originally, there was a part about pilot programs. And I'm actually very much in favor of doing research, evidence-based experimentation. You just mentioned one that Kyle was involved in, and that's useful information, right? And I think trying to aggregate that information, share it with others, I think I'm very much a fan of that. And so I guess I'm a fan of evidence-based decision making. And so if that means funding some pilot programs or experiments and trying to learn from them, let's do that before we spend a bunch of money that doesn't work.
Right. So I think the third pillar is very closely related to the second pillar, nutrition and health. And it's empowering consumers to make and have access to healthy choices. So the comment I wanted to add was that if we want to empower food pantry clients to make healthy choices, then we need to have healthy food in food pantries. And Emily, you mentioned the Emergency Food Assistance Program, TFAP, and that food by and large is very healthy. And there hasn't been much of it this year. It's what, 50% less than the previous 2 years.
Yes, we're still hoping we might see some of that in the end of the year appropriations, because that's definitely a priority, as well as increased funding in the Farm Bill next year.
And you didn't hear anything about TFAP in the conference?
No, and I mean, there were a lot of things talked about, but that was not necessarily one of them. Certainly something that we'll continue to talk about. The TFAP, the Emergency Food Assistance Program, for those who are unfamiliar, sort of the old government cheese program, but it is all the commodities, and it is the best food that comes to our members because it's purchased for them through the USDA and through the State Department of Health. and in a lot of rural counties, that is the bulk of the food that is coming to pantries because there aren't necessarily other resources in those areas, retail or manufacture, to provide food. We saw substantial increases in 2020 and 2021 through COVID relief that provided additional resources for TFAP purchase. And this year, we sort of went back to normal operations. So there's a substantial decrease in TFAP food. The USDA announced a month or so ago that there's an additional $500,000 that will come sort of through those regular systems in the same sort of way, but it's food that we won't see until probably January because there's a process there. So it takes, with all of that ordering, it takes about a 3-month lead time. The funding's not going to be, or wasn't released until this fiscal year, which is October 1, so there's a lag there. And the other thing that they're dealing with TFAP, as are everyone else, is supply chain issues where orders are canceled on a fairly regular basis. And so, you can say we've got this, this much TFAP food coming, but if you've got truckloads the orders are being canceled, you really don't. It's, that goes back to supply chain, and that's been tough for, the for-profit and the nonprofit food industries working with that. So we're hopeful. The federal budget that they would normally have passed before October 1, there is a continuing resolution, so they kind of put everything on hold and they're spending at the same levels until December 16th. After the election, at which point Congress will come back in and hopefully pass funding for the remainder of the federal fiscal year. And we're certainly looking for more TFAP investment there, as well as I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't mention what the federal government calls administrative funding. My food banks call it storage and distribution because the food does not, cool and move itself, or as one of my food bankers referred to it as partial cost reimbursement. For years, food banks have used private money to supplement the money that they get to run the TFAP program in their areas because it's the best food we were getting. And so it was worth it to go out and fundraise to provide the other half, essentially, of the money needed to store and distribute that product. That right now could be used on many, many, many other things, right? I mean, your utility bill alone, I think, would cover that second half of the load, or that return trip back. So we're looking for that, and then looking for a higher investment in TFAP and the Farm Bill that should be passed sometime in 2023, because it is a strong source of food support, a good economic investment. Again, the bonus commodities, or the Section 32, provides a strong price support for particular ag industries that need it at that time, and it's moving the best product we get. So no, it was not discussed. Yes, I will continue talking about it.
Thank you. Jason, what are your thoughts on empowering people to make healthy choices?
Yeah, that's a broad category, empowerment. I mean, I tend to think about, income. Do you have a means to get what you want? I think as a part of it. The other one is information. Like, do you have the right, do you have the knowledge set to know the consequences of the decisions you're making? And I think, the education certainly has a role, can play a role, can be more effective in some settings than others. I think, we do a lot of consumer survey work. I think people broadly understand they should be, which foods are, quote unquote healthy and unhealthy. But I think regarding specific dietary patterns and plans, I think makes sense. But again, even if you have the knowledge, if you don't have the income or the ability, or the foods aren't, there for you to choose, you can't act on that knowledge and information that you have. So, I don't have any specific thoughts there. And then other than I think sometimes the benefits of education can be oversold in that it's costly and it's hard to change people's behaviors sometimes. So I tend to think more about the income side of that empowerment.
So the fourth pillar is to support physical activity for all. And this, I'm always thinking about it in terms of how this will benefit the people that Food Finder serves. And I didn't see a lot that I could think would directly apply to food pantry clients. Emily, did you hear anything
No, but I will say this wasn't a pillar that I have dedicated a whole lot of time and energy to because it's not food. When we're looking at this from it's the conference on hunger and then health and nutrition. Those can often be different things than hunger. And so, I think there are ways that as a network, we talk about feeding the line and then, finding ways to shorten the line. Were it up to me, I would have been looking at, economic stability and other pieces as a pillar rather than physical education, but that's the health and nutrition part. Just me. So, there were some conversations. I will say that the programs that got the two biggest applause lines the entire day, the first was extending the child tax credit because we saw that made a significant impact in the households that were receiving it, and that the bulk of them in every state were spending it on basic needs that included food, right? So that was a very popular thing. And then I saw there's a question in the chat about this, and this is a whole different conversation, but also talking about free meals for students when they're in schools. That's a whole different conversation. And I don't think that's a conversation we're going to see happening in Congress. I think if a needle is moved on that, it's going to be on the local level more than anything. For several reasons that I'm not going to go into, but those I think would be more impactful in the child tax credit in the long run to eliminating and alleviating hunger than the physical activity piece. But again, that's not my background. That's not our view into this.
Jason, what are your thoughts on this?
I don't have a lot to say other than you can't out exercise a bad diet. I don't think so. I think that's sort of the first order priority. And I think, I do a lot of work with food, manufacturing, food production industries, but I think sometimes exercise serves as a little bit of a pass, we don't have to take responsibility because that they can do these other things that we over there too. Not to say exercise is unimportant, of course it is. But particularly for, some lower income households, the kinds of labor and jobs they do involve a lot of physical energy and exercise. And so obviously a lot of heterogeneity there across different kinds of people there as well. But no, I don't have any keen insights there.
Yeah, I feel the same way about this pillar as I did about the empowering people to buy healthier food. I think if low-income people had the same amount of money to buy gym memberships, more of them would buy gym memberships, or if they had enough time off from their jobs to exercise, more of them would. I think it's not something that's very likely to happen in that population without more income. So the fifth pillar is enhance nutrition and food security research and improve nutrition metrics, data collection, and research to inform nutrition and food security policy, particularly on the issues of equity, access, and disparities. And Jason, I'd like you to comment on this first because it seems like something you'd be really interested in.
Absolutely. And again, I've got a conflicted interest, a self-interest in this pillar. So of course I like it. Because I want to, make sure that the policies we pursue are well based in evidence and those sorts of things. The one piece of it I would say that if I had to focus some of that research and knowledge is we don't have great data on what people eat away from home, say restaurant food kinds of whether it's fast food or other sorts of food away from home. Dining behavior is just not great data. There's some data here and there, but that's a bit of a black hole in terms of our knowledge of people's diets and how they consume foods, how they substitute across different kinds of varieties. We just talked about households. If you're working two jobs, you're looking for something fast and convenient. Often that can be fast food, but we just don't know a lot about that. But there are starting to emerge some data sets where we can have better knowledge of what's happening and those substitutions that happen between different kinds of foodstuffs and different, food at home versus food away from home. So I think that's a real area where probably over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to learn a lot more about consumer buying and food purchasing behavior. The other kind of gold standard, evidence that we use is the NHANES survey. This is, they got pushed off because of COVID. This is where you actually take physical measurements of people. They have a diary of intake. But it's only done every not every 4, but it's done with a long, year lag between those. And so particularly when you're living in the middle of an urgent situation, whether it's a big recession or a pandemic, you don't have that, immediate knowledge, the kind of knowledge we were just talking about before, like, has food insecurity risen? Is hunger rising? I think if we could have data sets that were more timely, that gave us a better pulse on what's happening, just like, some better way to aggregate information across food banks about demand and information that was that people could respect and trust over time. I think that would be a very helpful source of information. I think we're moving that way. There's a lot of positive movement in that direction, but yeah, very, very much a fan of this this pillar. Although, as I said, I've got a self-interest in generating more data that we can use in academics.
Emily?
As someone who doesn't have a self-interest, I agree with what he said. So you're covered there. I mean, I would say we definitely need more research. And I think research will sort of bear out what food banks and people in the anti-hunger space have been saying for a long time, in that people don't inherently make bad choices if they're low income. People don't make any different choices than anyone else if they're low income. Yes, there are racial and equity issues all over the place, right? So we know these things. I mean, Katie and the folks at the food bank, we know what's happening just based upon thousands and thousands of anecdotal, contacts with clients. But until you have data, policymakers are not inclined to answer to your aggregated experience. They would listen to someone with that experience telling their own stories. But as an advocate, me aggregating what I know does not necessarily move the needle with people who do not have any experience with that aspect of life. If they've never been hungry, if they've never been food insecure, it's really difficult to explain to someone without having them know, what's going on out there. So, when we talk about SNAP access, for instance, there's one piece of research out there from as long as I've seen that talked about not what people are purchasing with their SNAP dollars, because largely that's proprietary and the retailers don't tell you that. That's in their system, but they're not necessarily going to share that with you. But they surveyed SNAP households and non-SNAP households, not about what they were purchasing with SNAP, but what they were purchasing, period. And the breakdowns were almost identical. So for me to tell a legislator that someone on SNAP, because they're low income, isn't making bad decisions, they're not going to be inclined to believe me unless I have a lot more data to back it up. Similar to the racial disparities in food access and in, meeting the needs of different communities, serving BIPOC families, that sort of thing. We don't know a lot about that. And this administration has been very strong in making a commitment to looking at equity in everything that they do. I think that's clearly reflected in the report as a whole, but in the data as well, and in the research piece. And it's research we don't have. And again, trying to explain this to someone who doesn't have that experience is really difficult unless you have some good data to back it up. So definitely a fan of data and research as part of an ongoing strategy, because we won't have good answers otherwise.
At this time, I think I'd like, Kyle, do you want to moderate the chat and see if
yeah, there were 2 questions. I think Emily kind of touched on this. Is there a difference between typical food insecurity and individuals or families just being concerned about overall price increases and looking for resources to help them maintain their budget?
I would defer to Katie and Kyle on this.
Yeah.
You're seeing clients, I'm not.
Yeah.
I think our numbers indicate, people are feeling that strain of inflation. So, but the clients we work with, their budgets are already so tight. So, any price increases, they're really, really going to feel it and need to seek out resources.
Well, I can say on our we do a survey of about 1,200 U.S. food consumers every month. And one of the questions we asked last month is, which item in your household budget is causing you the most stress right now? It's like 15 items, and food by far away was the number one item. And this is not even just low income. This is, everybody in the population. So when you look at, say, USDA measure of food insecurity, people think it's a measure of hunger. It's really a measure of like, is food affordable? I don't have enough money to buy the food I want. And I think that inflation directly hits on that affordability piece.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes confusing that in general, people may think that if you're food insecure, that means you don't have any food. But what it more likely means is that you don't have access to good nutrition, that you don't have enough money to buy the things that you'd really like to eat. The thing that concerns me related to this is that we're seeing 100 new households a week in the fresh market. So that tells me that people that were on the edge, that were making it, have fallen into needing our help because of the inflation and high fuel prices and other things that are taking their limited income.
Ray asks, what about the end of the pandemic program for making lunch and breakfast free?
I'm happy to talk about that one. So that ended the end of last school year. I will say there is a little bit of a push going on in the advocacy space to encourage Congress to include free meals for the remainder of this school year in the budget package that they will pass in December. We can have conversations about who pays for what. We learned that we saw food insecurity amongst children decrease in Indiana during the pandemic as a result of programs like this, as a result of programs like the pandemic EBT, which is also in this report to recommend to continue. We know where the kids are, and we know how to serve them when they're there. What a lot of people don't realize, and I think this plays into the politics of it, is every meal that is served at a school is subsidized. It's whether you're paying at a reduced rate, the regular subsidized paid rate, or a free rate. It's become politicized in that we don't need to feed kids who don't have trouble affording it. The reality is that lunches and breakfasts at school that involve families paying, in many cases, cause more expense for the school than just feeding them for free. And that's something that we're not telling a very good story about. There's already a program called the Community Eligibility Provision that if you have students in your school or district, you can do it either way, that 40% of them are directly certified, which means they're already enrolled in a means tested program, SNAP, TANF, Medicaid, one of those things. If 40% of the kids in that building or district are already on free lunch, you can feed the entire school or district for free. And there's a reimbursement rate that the school gets that's high at a higher rate. It's not always the most economically feasible things for districts. There's a break-even point in there somewhere. But we're not talking about the number of kids that are enrolled in free and reduced. We're talking about the kids who don't even have to apply because they're already certified. That program is out there. There's been conversations about reducing that threshold. There's been conversations about raising that threshold. The program is out there. Not every school that's eligible participates. I can tell you the district that my children go to school in is eligible and they don't participate, much to my consternation, and I continue to badger them because it's what I do. But there are those programs out there. And I think if we want to talk about adding a new component to the broader child nutrition package, we need to be able to talk about it better to explain why. And it for different people, it's going to be a different why, right? For some people, it's a moral imperative. They're stuck there. We should probably feed them anyway. For other people, they're not there. And so we need to have a conversation as to why there's a financial reason for that school district that it would be better if they fed everyone for free, because then they don't have to go looking for overdue lunch fees. They don't have to have a person that they have to pay to sit at the register. They don't have to do upgrades on this, at the other thing. There are reasons that it is much cheaper for many schools to just provide all of them meals for free. I think that's a conversation that people on this call can have with their friends and neighbors and your elected officials to explain why you believe what you believe. But I think we're, as an advocacy community, we're not telling the story well yet.
Another factor in that is that there are children who are eligible for the free and reduced lunch program, but they never get registered for it in a lot of schools. I would say there are more kids in that category than there are people cheating the system. Jason, do you have any last comments?
No, other than just an anecdotal comment. My father was a school superintendent while I was growing up, and he would complain about how confusing and complicated the school lunch programs were. So that's about the extent of my knowledge there. So it's a challenge for schools to put all the politics and the rest aside. Just conforming with the federal guidelines is a real headache. But no, I appreciate the opportunity to engage here. And I think from a research perspective or outreach, if there are things that we can be doing at Purdue, help with studies, help understand, what your clients are wanting and needing, please give me a call. I'd be happy to see what we could do to help them.
Okay, thanks. And we have a big database full of low-income people that are using food services. So,
Fantastic.
Emily, anything you'd like to say?
I would like to thank Jason for his research. I'm very excited that it's there, and I'm glad that you all are doing it, because it's really helpful to talk to policymakers to say, look, this is coming from Purdue. It's not me saying it. It's people who actually do research for a living, and that is not me. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody. I'm glad that folks are interested in the White House Conference, and I would ask you to do the same that everyone else is doing. Pay attention, continue to encourage our elected officials to do the things that are in this or that aren't in it, that we need to move the needle.
Well, thank you all for giving us your lunch hour and coming to talk about this important conference. And thank you again to our presenters. And I think with that, we're at 12:29. So I think we'll go ahead and end the Zoom. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.